morning, everyone. Yeah, so this is Prince Agwu. So you can now forget about what you've heard about Prince Agwu and hear from Prince Agwu physically. All right, I'm Prince Agwu, as you've heard. I am an academic with the University of Nigeria, as well a research fellow with the Health Policy Research Group. Apparently one of the largest health research institutes in West Africa. And today I'm going to be talking about what we basically know about science, particularly scientific evidence. But I'm going to be moving a step further to make us understand what perhaps we never know up until this time, and that is how science has gone a long way to inform governance and development. Hence, it is said to be the mediator between governance and development. The question of what is science should come to mind. I believe everyone who has had some level of education should understand, or perhaps might have heard, about science. But defining science has evolved over the years. But I'm going to be tracing it back to perhaps what we heard during integrated science in junior secondary school, and that's in the work of Ivan Pavlov. There is this story of a dog, a bell, and a food. And what Pavlov did was to condition the behavior of a dog to always salivate whenever there is the ringing of a bell. This is to say that two terms that can never be left out in defining science is or are causes and effects. Pavlov tried to be very deliberate with the behavior of the dog by making the dog constantly looking out for a meal each time the dog hears the bell. And that's what Ralph Waldo Emerson had to say, that weak men believe in luck and circumstance, but strong men believe in cause and effect. Hence, anybody who tries to appreciate what science is automatically becomes a strong man, or perhaps a strong woman for gender balance. And I would go further to explain how this happens. The procedure of science. There is an evolutionary process or processes to which science must follow. First, science starts with our senses. What we see, what we smell, what we taste, what we hear, and what we feel. These are our five senses. And these five senses relate with the experiences of our world. In the event of, let's say, I'm in a house and there is a dead rat somewhere, I get to perceive that dead rat. Very discomforting. I'll be prepared to want to do something about it, to look for the dead rat, take off the dead rat, and if the dead rat is taken off, the smell in the house goes off. It is one thing to experience with your senses. It is another thing to understand what your senses must have experienced. And lastly, it is important to do something about what you've experienced with your senses, what you've understood from your senses. Otherwise, it is incomplete. And that is why Immanuel Kant believed that of all things in our world, what would move us from one point to the other has to do with the amount of reasoning to what we apply to what we feel, what we see, what we smell, what we hear, and what we taste. In essence, I'm only trying to make you understand that even while our senses are important to make us experience what knowledge is, it shouldn't end there. It should move to doing something about it, trying to understand the dynamics around it, and importantly, taking action. This is where the scientist is very key. Everything in our world is science. And that is why Galileo Galilei, whom we refer to as the father of modern science, said, and I quote, "Measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so." In essence, at the end of the day, I'll be expecting each and every one here, when you go out there and perhaps a politician puts out a policy or puts out a program, you should be able to ask, what is the evidence that must have inspired this policy or this program? Because everything in our society, to a very large extent, is measurable. And what science is making us to understand is that we shouldn't be making decisions just from our mere head knowledge, but by going through some process of questioning, some process of rigorous thinking, some process of empiricism before we get to arrive at any conclusion. Years ago, when I was employed as an academic, I met some people to ask, what does it really entail to be a lecturer? And one of my mentors said to me, when you are employed as a lecturer, even though it is your responsibility to teach in the class, teaching is just 10% or perhaps 12 to 15% of what you're employed to do. He said, the essence of having the intellectual sector of our society is to constantly put knowledge out there for policies to be made, for programs to be made, for strategies to be implemented. It is not just about teaching in the class. And that is why each time ASU or any of the teaching, research association is on strike, and people are saying that they aren't working. To be very honest, it's false. Academics are divided into two: the social science academics and the natural science academics. The social science academics, you have most of us in the field, moving through places that you may never want to go to. When I did the field study for my PhD, I had to travel to Edo State, and I lived for 2 months in Edo State. What was I doing? Trying to understudy what trafficking looks like in Edo State. Identifying survivors of human trafficking, tracing them to their houses, tracing them to their villages, and understanding whatsoever must have driven them into being trafficked. When the academic goes about, gathers this data, either the one who spends his time in the laboratory or the one who spends his time doing what we call field visits, he comes back, puts this data together, and begins to do some synthesis, synthesizing the thesis and the antithesis into arriving at empirically verified conclusions. The essence of these conclusions he reaches is to take these conclusions to policymakers and ask them, please, we've done this research, we have this finding. It is now time for you to look at this finding and see how you can make our society better. For some of them, they go to people who are at the front line. The doctor wouldn't be able to practice if he doesn't acquaint himself with scientific evidence. At a time, we had procedures that today we consider those procedures not to make any more sense. How did the medical doctor come about to discover that a procedure that was very appreciated in 1999 is no longer appreciated in 2022? It is as a result of scientific evidence. In essence, the academic is the mediator between governance and development. And I will explain further. Yeah, this is an ecosystem of what the academic does. You can see the researcher, and there's so many persons the researcher has to interact with. Of course, you can see that the researcher might not really interact with the student so much, but why he has to interact with the student is that the student must acquaint himself or herself with recent development, recent evolution in knowledge building. If the student is not acquainted with what is in vogue, the knowledge that is in vogue, we end up producing very quack students. And that is why sometimes when I meet with lecturers who in about 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of lecture, they don't make reference to scientific escapades of theirs, I begin to question the quality of the lecturer. If you are in any field, it is expected that you are to spend credible, reasonable amount of your time doing the real business of research. And so that when you come to meet the student in class, you are making the student to understand what the trajectory of knowledge building, what has evolved over time, better preparing our human capacity for national development and of course for international development. So many persons the researcher interacts with. And that is why, at the end of the day, I would want you to understand that the responsibility of the academic isn't only to interface with students in class. We do a lot more than just interfacing with students in class. And I'll explain further. We have this guy, Nostradamus. People who were born, let's say, in the 1980s and early 1990s must have come across the movie, The Man Who Saw Tomorrow. Michel de Nostradame, popularly known as Nostradamus, existed in the 16th century. And in that time in France, there was an outbreak of the bubonic plague, which is akin to what we experienced just recently, or what we're still experiencing, COVID-19. Lots of people were dying. What did Nostradamus, try to do at that time? Nostradamus looked at the public health practices of people in that time and discovered that there was one thing that these guys were missing, and that is hygiene. Nostradamus went into practice trying to treat people with bubonic plague by exposing them, one, to fresh air, asking them to wash their hands regularly, and living in clean environment. At the end of the day, Nostradamus became the face of the remedy to the bubonic plague in the 16th century that caused the French and the Italian government at that time to pump in so much money into cleaning up the environment. Now we can see how what happened in the 16th century became the order of the day when we had COVID-19. This is the importance of science, looking at issues and explaining these issues through empirically verified positions and all. And so, I'm going to come back home. Practical scientific approach to problems. Nigeria has about 10 million children out of school, according to the National Bureau of Statistics, and according to the UNICEF, 18 million. The question is, what are we doing about our out-of-school children? Very simple. First thing, where are these out-of-school children located? Once you answer the question, the next thing is to ask, what are the factors that are putting these children out of school? And once you answer that, the next is to ask again, what are the feasible strategies we can use in remedying the factors that have put those children out of school? This is how an average scientist would think about this problem. Next, very important, minimum wage. Minimum wage in the UK is £9 per hour. Scientific evidence brought about the minimum wage in the UK. How? The Low Pay Commission in the 1990s did a work, and they went through a landmark work produced by Card and Greger, 350 pieces of literature, 580 evidence submissions, and 233 field visits before they had to benchmark what should be the minimum wage for citizens in the UK. The essence of the minimum wage is to have people live above poverty. And as you can see in the statistics, the minimum wage in London is different from the minimum wage across other parts of the UK. And that's because of how expensive London is. Now, let's get down to Nigeria and see what informed our minimum wage. Give us our new minimum wage now. No evidence, no research, no interview, no surveys, and we just came up with random figure from 18,000 to 30,000. This is quite disappointing. Policies without science are equal to policies with bad science. The agricultural sector is one we should look into. Between 2011 and 2020, Nigeria has put in place about 7 core agricultural policies. But what do we have? Global hunger index at 28.3%. And in terms of hunger, Nigeria is ranked 103 of 116 countries. Our food inflation is over 18%. And in about 9 years, between 2011 and 2020, we've had 7 core agricultural policies. The question, what must have informed these policies? Bad science or no science? In the case of insecurity, my advice to the people within the security architecture is they should please go and create a repository of academic evidence that should inform our security approaches. We don't want this. We don't want it. Yeah. We want a situation where those in charge of our security would engage nationals, citizens, with scientific evidence stating what the precipitating factors of our insecurity are, and moving to saying that based on evidence, we can be able to tackle insecurity with A, with B, and with C. It is then that we will be talking. Next, I'm going to skip this and move over to this. The top developed countries in Africa by Human Development Index, HDI, do not have the most number of universities. Mauritius is the most developed country in Africa, and Mauritius has about 30 universities. Nigeria is not among the top 10 developed economies in Africa. Nigeria has over 170 universities. In essence, if by the number of academic institutions we have, our development will be made, then Nigeria should be the most developed country in Africa. Disappointedly, it is not so. And finally, what do we do? First, as a people, we must learn to value science. When you see an academic, pay respect to that academic. He's doing a lot. We must pay attention to identifying good science and infusing this good science into our policies and programs. 3, we must learn how to communicate our science. Carry the people who are the non-academics and the academics along. And we must have the normal people who are away from the academia engaging our policymakers and asking them the reasons for their decisions, because the reasons for their decisions should stem from scientific evidence. 4, we must learn how to fund science, pumping money into our academic institutions, pumping money into our academic structures, pumping money into our scientific ecosystem. And lastly, after doing all of these, we must get to the level where we learn how to utilize science to make decisions, utilize evidence to make policies, utilize scientific evidence to make programs. It is then that our development can be said to really be development. Thank you so much.